This is Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program John Kaag for a conversation about Henry David Thoreau and work. John Kaag is the Donohue Professor of Ethics and the Arts at UMass Lowell and External Professor at the Santa Fe Institute. He is the co-author of a new book along with Jonathan Van Belle called Henry at Work, Thoreau on Making a Living. John Kaag, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks so much for having me, Mitch.
Henry David Thoreau wrote this, quote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." That was a quote that was important for you in this work that you have here. What did Henry David Thoreau mean by the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation?
It's interesting because in the original manuscript, Thoreau actually says all men live lives of quiet desperation. And I think that what Thoreau was gesturing to was the rise of the industrial world and how the industrial world would radically affect our personal lives and psychological lives and contribute to the rise of mental struggles, depression, anxiety, compulsion, and that modern consumerism, along with modern capitalism, really pushes humans like us away from nature into a type of society that is not particularly interested in individuals flourishing or their original expression or their creativity, but rather making them take certain roles in society and in their work lives. Thoreau's sort of retreat to Walden in the 1840s was the attempt to counteract that desperation.
What is happening in his world at this time? Obviously, this is sort of the earlier years of the Industrial Revolution?
It is. I mean, Thoreau graduated Harvard and then immediately confronted the economic panic of 1837, which basically wiped out a third of all disposable income in the United States. People lost their jobs. It was very much like the pandemic to some extent. And Thoreau was confronting the false promises of the Industrial Revolution and the promises of American progress in the late 1830s and into the early 1840s. Thoreau's community outside of Boston in Concord, Massachusetts, was the neighbor to towns such as Manchester, New Hampshire, Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Lowell, Massachusetts, where the mills and factories of the Industrial Revolution, some of the biggest in the world at the time, popped up. And Thoreau watched the growth of that sort of industrial behemoth and was concerned about the way that it would dramatically affect the natural world, but also the human beings that worked inside those factories.
Did he write about the factories?
He did. In fact, it's curious. Within Walden, in fact, he even talks about the girls working at the factories. And he does so in a chapter entitled Solitude. And his point in that chapter is that the girls working in the factories, his expression, didn't have space for solitude or to be by themselves or to express themselves in original or individual ways, that their lives were orchestrated for them and structured very tightly around the clock in that sort of like mechanized way.
Isn't Walden's first chapter or very early in the book even named Economy?
That's right. The first chapter of Walden is entitled Economy, which seems sort of ironic since the first chapter of Walden is such a critical assessment of our current economic models. What Thoreau, however, is trying to do is direct us back to a an older understanding of economy, which traces its origins to a word that means to dwell and to make a home. And Thoreau, in the first chapter of Walden, gives a very nice description of what is necessary to dwelling and making a home, which is quite different from what we in the modern day, with all of our desires and our consumptive practices and consumerism, think is necessary for providing a home for ourselves. For Thoreau, he points out that what is really necessary in life is shelter, food, clothing, and vital warmth. And vital warmth, he means figuratively, the sort of emotional warmth that we get from a hearth, from the sort of center of a home, which doesn't necessarily have to do with the size of the home or how much your mortgage is, but the sort of interactions that take place within the home.
It's interesting. In your book, Henry at Work, you're trying to show that Henry David Thoreau was quite the worker rather than the stereotype of a free lover that he has acquired through time. But we also, it's also interesting, we think of Henry David Thoreau also as a naturalist and an abolitionist and many other things, but never as an economist.
And I think we should. Thoreau, first, he was a worker. He works at least a dozen jobs, by my count, from building his own house to teaching in schools to being a nanny to Emerson's children to building fences and surveying the landscape, and as a scientist, quite frankly, and as an inventor, inventing pencils. Henry worked constantly, but he actually was interested in reevaluating why we work and what we work for. He was an expert in both home economics, which was at the time a relatively new idea. Lydia Maria Child wrote a book called The Frugal Housewife, which gave an account of what primarily women had to do in order to keep up their house. Thoreau read The Frugal Housewife and applied it to Walden. And his point was that our feelings about the goods that we must acquire in life are really dictated by our desires, and at least in the modern age, our overblown desires. And so studies that have come out recently regarding the amount of money that one needs to make in order to be happy, Thoreau was very interested in that sort of study. And he would have probably anticipated and echoed many of the findings, which are, after a certain point where the necessities in life are secured, the quality of life and the happiness of individuals is not necessarily hinged to millions or making millions, but rather hinged to other vital goods, our spiritual practices, our contemplative practices, our practices of companionship. And Thoreau was one of the first individuals in the United States to key in on that point and to make it an economic topic.
And make it part of work, to be expressed through work.
Exactly. And Thoreau is interested in figuring out what makes work meaningful. We oftentimes in the Judeo-Christian tradition regard work as a curse. When Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden for disobeying God, they are put to work as a punishment. That's what God sets out for them, as a type of work/punishment. What Thoreau, I think, is trying to do at Walden Pond is to reclaim work as a type of salvation, as a type of understanding how it can be made meaningful and even sometimes sacred, which today, with our modern industrial system, it's sometimes very hard to remember that work can be meaningful. Work can be sacred. But that's what Thoreau's trying to get at when he's, building his hut at Walden Pond.
I want to go back to that book, The Frugal Housewife. That piqued my interest, and it made me wonder and think, does this mean that women were really some of our earliest American economists?
I mean, when it comes to figuring out what we spend our money on, why we spend our money, and what is required for us to spend and acquire, in order to make a living, Lydia Maria Child was among the first. When it comes to observations about the alienation of labor and the way that modern industrialism alienates its workers, Thoreau was among the first. He was contemporaries, in fact, with Marx, in terms of identifying ways in which the company system and the industrial system made us feel less human and divorced ourselves from both the natural world and from the needs of production.
I'm going to come back to Marx in a moment, but just a follow-up question. Henry David Thoreau, and maybe this is connected, maybe not, did, I think, what was at the time considered to be the work that women did, such as babysit children.
Absolutely. And I mean, Thoreau never had a nuclear family of his own, and never had a long-standing romantic partner. But he was a child rearer par excellence, and he both helped raise Emerson's children with Emerson's second wife when Emerson was away in Europe, spent long stints of time with the Emerson children, and also served as a schoolmaster for elementary school students straight up through to being a college tutor. He was deeply tied to sort of child rearing, but also to the more mundane tasks of life, which oftentimes were relegated to women of the time: washing clothes, mending clothes, cleaning house. And he took these chores up as the real work of life, and was one of the, I was raised by a single mother, and I look at Thoreau and I think, wow, you really are honoring a lot of the basic manual tasks of life in ways that many of your male contemporaries did not. And so I find that rather interesting.
Henry David Thoreau is part of this movement that we know as the Transcendentalist, sort of the founder of that movement. You mentioned Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. It in some ways we could call this, it was largely men, but there were also pretty feminists that had women as part of it. I think of Margaret Fuller as an example, and she wasn't the only one. Peabody would be another.
That's right. I mean, we oftentimes think about transcendentalism and this sort of Promethean self-reliance that it oftentimes is thought of putting forward. It sort of resonates with the captains of industry and the power of the single individual. And what we forget, and what we should not forget, is that it was part of a movement of social reform, which involved both first wave feminism, you mentioned Margaret Fuller, working very hard for political and legal rights for women during the 1830s and 1840s, and contiguous with the abolitionism that we saw, coming and sort of gathering force through the 1830s and 1840s in the lead up to the Civil War.
We mentioned Karl Marx earlier. Is there overlap between Henry David Thoreau and Karl Marx? Work and ideas is what I mean, but I also mean, is there any evidence that they knew of each other?
Not to my knowledge, although I would be very interested if a listener were to clue me into that relationship. The similarity between their work, however, is obvious and marked. And one of the insights that Thoreau has prior to Marx is the way that the industrial system created widespread alienation, a feeling of widespread alienation.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with John Kaag. John Kaag is the Donohue Professor of Ethics and Arts at UMass Lowell and external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. He is co-author with Jonathan Van Belle of a book that we are in conversation about. It's called Henry at Work, Thoreau on Making a Living. Let me come back to this term you put out there, self-reliance. This is also an important term. One of the iconic essays that sort of in the early years that maybe even helps kick off the transcendentalist movement was by Ralph Waldo Emerson called Self-Reliance. You took on a little bit about what that actually means. Talk to me more, because you're right. When I think of self-reliance, I'm thinking of pulling oneself up from the straps of their own boots.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, it resonates with many of my students because it seems to fit with this sort of American idea of freedom and power and the power of the individual. But I think for Thoreau and also for Emerson, self-reliance was to be tempered by another concept in Transcendentalists known as compensation. Compensation was a essay, the sister essay to Self-Reliance, and they're supposed to be read together. Compensation, the basic gist of it is that no matter how free we are, no matter how self-reliant we are, we always operate in a wider social, political, and cosmic order in a sort of grand give and take. At a practical level, Thoreau observes that being self-reliant for him at Walden involved supporting himself and providing the necessities of life for himself in ways that kept him off the back of other workers. That oftentimes in our industrial system, we depend on others to provide food, clothing, shelter, and the goods of life. Living simply and being self-reliant in a simple way for Thoreau at Walden was a way to extract him from that system of consumption and production and to supply himself with what he needed rather than depending on others. And I think if you put that in the context of a social and political movement, there's not a huge surprise that Gandhi looks to Thoreau and said that his notion of satyagraha, which was independence and self-reliance for India, involved providing economically for themselves, for the citizens of India, such that they weren't reliant on colonialism. And a similar sort of idea percolates through Walden.
Can ideas of self-reliance be used to criticize, say, welfare?
That's right. So, I mean, Thoreau in Walden makes the comment that he does not support philanthropy and doesn't support a welfare state. And this is a moment that we have to take seriously, that Thoreau was a person who he himself had certain inconsistencies and certain limitations, and we can disagree with him. We can say, Thoreau, you're simply not right about this. But Thoreau's point, I think, during the time and when he criticized philanthropy of the time was that philanthropy and charity of his time did not typically respect the autonomy or the ability to be self-reliant for individuals who might find themselves under the poverty line. It was simply a matter of providing quick money for individuals below the poverty line. And that's what Thoreau was concerned about, or was not a supporter of. But honestly, when I read those sections on philanthropy, I have to say to myself, I think, Thoreau, you seem awfully like a Harvard grad who still had certain types of privileges. So we have to keep that in mind. That comment, I will say, is in tension with some of the more compassionate remarks that he makes about the former slaves that lived as neighbors in Walden Woods, and some of the more compassionate things that he has to say about the Irish workers, who, in fact, Thoreau inherits much of his hut. Thoreau didn't just make his hut from nothing. He bought it from an Irish worker who was moving down the line.
He disassembled it and then put it back together?
That's correct.
Yeah. And there's also a relation to his ideas of self-reliant and slavery. That to be an abolitionist meant you should be self-reliant. So, like you said, in some way, so you're not on the backs of others.
That's right. And I mean, it does not make any sense for a transcendentalist of this time to advocate self-reliance and then fully ignore then a large swath of the American population of the time were anything but self-reliant because of oppression. And Emerson was much slower than Thoreau actually in supporting abolitionism. Abolitionism was actually a movement carried out in the 1830s and 1840s by the women of Boston and Concord. And Thoreau found himself in close companionship with these women activists, and out of sync with many of the more popular speakers of the time, Emerson being the most notable.
And coming back to philanthropy and welfare, I think it is important to say Emerson isn't of our time. We don't know what he would, Thoreau isn't of our time. We don't know what he would think about welfare and social help that comes from the government today. In his time, you could still probably make some kind of an existence without conforming to the industrial world, and wouldn't necessarily end up living underneath a freeway overpass like you would today.
That's right. And I mean, if you think about Walden, he was regarded as moving outside of Concord and living with the proverbial nobodies of America's social circle. The people who lived in Walden Woods were much poorer than your average Concord inhabitant. And so, but Thoreau was still able to live, and he was able to build his own shelter. For the most part, he was able to sustain himself, although there's, for the last 15 years, we've criticized Thoreau for doing his washing with his mother back in Concord. So he wasn't that self-reliant. But your point is a good one, that there are even greater prohibitions against living by oneself, living off the grid, living outside of the norms of society today than there were in Thoreau's day. If you think about the United States that Thoreau lives in, it's really still a frontier community. And in fact, Thoreau's Concord is regarded as a certain type of frontier backwater of Boston. To the west was much wilder, and the individuals living on the frontier were able to eke out a living by virtue of their own hands for the most part.
We often think of Walden and his 2 years living in Walden, which he only lived there 2 years. He didn't live there all his life. We oftentimes think of Walden as this pristine place, untouched by industrialization. But in fact, that's not what it was at all. There were train tracks, and again, trains are important today, really important in his day, transformed society in some ways, similar to how the internet has transformed our society. And there were train tracks. The train went right by his hut almost every day, several times a day.
That's right. I mean, when he writes the chapter in Walden entitled Sounds, most of the reflections in that chapter are about the railroad and about the way that the railroad is interrupting natural beauty. Some scholars recently have observed that Thoreau is a theorist of what's known as the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene being the epoch in which we're living now, which is one where the natural world and human purposes and civilization have become inextricably bound together. And we see that with the railroad, that the railroad cut through nature in a way that was irrevocable and dramatically affected the natural world in irreversible ways. And Thoreau's account of Walden is an account of an Anthropocene world where wild and human practices are tied together and are constantly affecting one another. We can think about that in terms of contemporary environmentalism with, greenhouse emissions today. But Thoreau was on the case of that 170 years ago.
I interviewed several years ago Laura Dassow-Walls, who wrote a recent biography on Henry David Thoreau. And that interview made me definitely look at Henry David Thoreau's work quite differently in a sense of, in how I could apply it today. He's writing about a changing world. He's writing about modernization of his time. And if you look at it that way, it still applies to us today.
That's right. And I mean, in part, that's why we wrote Henry at Work, because we thought about Thoreau as speaking to our own particular moment, to a post-COVID world in which, or in a in a COVID world where we are concerned about traditional practices of work, that we are more suspicious than ever of the brick and mortar office building. We are more protective of our time and more inclined to want to work from home, that we are regarding hobbies and the maker movement as important again. And this is a moment that Thoreau anticipated and spoke to. And as technology becomes more automated, as as human workers are sometimes phased out for robotic workers, this is a certain moment that Thoreau anticipated, and he said, "This is our future." And his future is right now. And he was speaking to his future, which means he's speaking to us.
What did this term alienation, mean to him?
So Thoreau believes, much like the ancient Cynics or ancient Stoics, that getting back to nature. And we can think about civilization and the requirements of, quote, being civilized as the requirements to divorce ourselves from the natural order. And Thoreau was suspicious of civilization and social institutions, just like ancient Cynics were, just as the Cynics of today are. That society doesn't necessarily lead us to live more flourishing or meaningful lives, but rather that social institutions and society corrupts us. Now, that's one aspect. The other aspect is the way that industrialism requires us to play particular roles that are highly specialized, and that we do not necessarily get to use the full function of our abilities, the full array of our abilities in our daily work lives, that we are tasked with providing very specific products or very specific parts to other products, and that our lives become associated with those very, very narrow tasks. And Thoreau and Emerson, along with, again, a contemporary Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, they're very concerned about the way that the roles of modern society truncate us, that we perform just a small array of what we could actually accomplish.
may not necessarily mean what they thought, but what it invokes in me in hearing that is, we evolved in a natural world, and evolution happens very slowly. And with the Industrial Revolution, we dramatically changed the planet in ways that many species can't keep up with. And I suspect in the future, we may change the planet so much that we can't stay with as well.
That's right. And I mean, that puts into stark relief the meaning of Thoreau's comment that in wildness is the preservation of the world. Wildness for Thoreau, I think, means both literal wildness, in other words, the polar ice caps that keep us alive, that are in some ways, for a long time, unaffected by human activity, that type of wildness. But also he means it in a figurative sense, that what keeps us alive and what preserves our world, what makes our world meaningful, is at least in part the belief that we can explore the outer bounds of our experiences, that we can challenge ourselves, that we can transcend ourselves. And he's concerned that our current work practices do the opposite, that they don't challenge us, that they don't encourage us toward transcendence, that they don't actually encourage us to grow. And having worked a bunch of very menial / meaningless, and they're not the same things necessarily, but I've worked meaningless menial jobs. I've worked meaningless, very esoteric jobs. But having worked enough of those meaningless jobs, I can tell you that he's probably right about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because in his world, and maybe I'm off on this, but I'm assuming in his world, nature is still abundant, and there's a sense of abundancy with nature. I don't know how many people actually thought there's going to be a day where there would be very little nature, whereas today you kind of have to travel to get to a place that is still considered quote unquote wild. Now you could say, well, we're nature too, so what we do is also natural, and that's fair. But we live in a world today in which actually we can envision a world in which there are no more wild places, because they're so hard to get to where they still are.
That's true. And I think that's in Thoreau's day, you're right. Surrounding Concord was a type of wilderness or wildness that I live in Concord today, and I can tell you it's no longer as wild as in Thoreau's day. It's become much more tamed and civilized. That being said, the United States and the world at large is broad, and there are places for us to experience what Thoreau himself was after at Walden. And you don't necessarily have to go to the highest peak in Maine, like Mount Katahdin, such as which Thoreau did, in order to get it. And Thoreau, I believe, was encouraging us to find our own Walden. In other words, find our own place where we can pay attention to the natural order, pay attention to our authentic selves, and experience something of wildness in our own backyard. That's harder today than in Thoreau's, but it seems to me that it's still possible.
I live in downtown Oakland, where we have this amazing lake right in the middle of the city that's connected to the bay, the San Francisco Bay, hence connected to the ocean. And it's governed by tides, and you get wildness in it. You get fish and seabirds and all kinds of stuff in it, and right in the heart of the city. And to me, that was the lesson. Like, oh, right, in your backyard, you still can find a sense of nature. And I really tuned into it, as you mentioned, how the pandemic changed things when the pandemic happened, because suddenly I was stuck home at all the time. So I went around the lake every day, started noticing it, even listened to Walden audiobook as I did it. For you, in your entryway into this book, into these ideas, came after your own sort of struggles, specifically a health scare.
Yes. When I was 40, I was a big runner for a long time. I ran long distance as fast as I could. And then that caught up to me, because when I was 40, I hopped off of a treadmill at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and went into full cardiac arrest. And they shocked me back after 2 minutes. And then rushed me down to Tufts Medical Center where I had cardiac surgery, to fix a congenital disorder that I had had since birth. And that experience changed my orientation to work in a very real way. It slowed me down necessarily. It really questioned or led me to question how fast I had been living life and my engagement in the rat race of life. And
other than just running fast?
Oh yeah, of course. I wrote maniacally. I wrote books maniacally. I taught my heart out. I taught extra classes. I worked 2 extra jobs. Yeah, I mean,
You were 40. Why not?
Say again?
You were 40.
Why not?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I can tell you why not.
Yeah.
Because you sometimes wind up having a cardiac arrest, which wakes you up. So part of Henry at Work was also my writing completely stopped at the time. I had written Hiking with Nietzsche and American Philosophy of Love Story, and then afterward, it completely stopped. I got remarried to my wife, Kathleen, and just went through this real existential upside downness. And that upside downness led me to reach out to my co-author, Jonathan Van Belle, and I said, I can't write this thing by myself. I can't work at all. I need help. And Jonathan was kind enough to sort of work it through with me. And he said, well, why don't we talk, if you're having trouble working, why don't we talk about work? Why don't we write about Thoreau and work? And I'll do it with you. And that's what we did as co-workers.
Did Henry David Thoreau actually, you mentioned he was a teacher, so he did actually have jobs with structures that were imposed on him.
That's right. I mean, he did. He worked several jobs, and one of which included a teacher. Notably, however, the structures that Thoreau had to follow in being a teacher oftentimes led him to quit his job. One of those structures or one of those demands is that he exact corporal punishment on his students. And after doing it just one time, he quit his job, a very lucrative job, by the way, which would have made him probably one of the most respectable members of the Concord community. And Thoreau simply gave it up because it was out of sync with his moral code. And that gives us some sort of, sense that maybe moral consciousness is more important than the structures of employment.
The hitting of the kids were against his moral code?
Yes, although I have to say that he did do it once, which has always puzzled me.
I mean, we do funny things for work. It's kind of the point, right? The things that we're forced to do that maybe we're uncomfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the points that we make in the book is that our employers are paying us not just for the tasks that we perform for them, but also for the time that we give up of our lives, that which is most important, the time that we have left. And they're really paying us for the sort of opportunity cost that we are constantly making in our employment.
I'm assuming somebody might be listening to us right now and say, well, this sounds great, and I love these ideals. However, we live in a world that's seen incredible inflation. I'm having a hard time making it, and I have to do this 9-to-5 thing to make ends meet.
Oh, absolutely. And so, I mean, we speak to a number of workers and relate those interviews in the course of Henry at Work. And one gentleman said to us, like, I have to do this job. I have to make money. And there is a point below which individuals do have to work. I mean, they have to simply put bread on the table and pay their mortgage or pay their rent. Thoreau, interestingly, does say that many people could minimize their wants and needs, which then creates the space to choose a different job. And I think that that's a point that some of us in our contemporary economic system could really pay attention to. And the issue about I have to work in order to keep up with the Joneses is different than I have to work in order to put the basic subsistence living on the table. And we have to be honest about where we fall in that question. Now, when it comes to individuals who are skirting or flirting at the poverty line in terms of making their ends meet, we need as a society to be critical of an economic system that disadvantages the least advantaged of us and forces individuals into jobs of exploitation, jobs that dehumanize, and we need to be extremely critical of those type of economic practices, as Thoreau was. I mean, civil disobedience and Walden. So civil disobedience, the idea that we should break certain laws and norms if they are unjust, that's Thoreau's position, is not unrelated to his economic position as expressed in Walden.
How so? Tell me more. Explain that.
So Thoreau, while he was at Walden, actually was thrown into jail for not paying his taxes that would have supported the Mexican-American War, which would have expanded slavery. Thoreau believes that the economic move to live simply and self-reliantly off the grid, away from certain government support, not needing government support, allows you as individuals, or allows us as individuals, to push back against the government in particular ways when the government is executing laws in our behalf that we don't support and that we find immoral. The idea of opposing slavery and the idea of living simply and prioritizing our moral conscience over, for example, the wealth and goods of the modern day, and over the sort of keeping up with the Joneses that Thoreau rejects at Walden, go in tandem. The idea that we can dissent from certain government practices and that we need to keep our own needs and wants in check so that we can prioritize what is actually important is, I think, part and parcel of Walden, but also civil disobedience.
There's also the societal pressures to stick with that nine to five. If if you're suddenly like, I'm giving up my gig to go follow my bliss, people around you may be circumspect about that, may frown at you for doing that. Family may frown at you for doing that.
Hugely. And in fact, Walden is a story of a man who is accounting for and giving a recounting of how that societal pressure actually operates. And when his visitors come to Walden and say, "What are you doing here? You live here?" That's a part of Walden. Thoreau says, "Of course, this is the best place to live, and I'll tell you why. And I'll tell you why you're living in a prison in Concord." He's trying to push back against that societal pressure by writing Walden, by living the way that he does. Thoreau is regarded as a bit of a misfit, as an outcast. Even his best friends, Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, says that in his eulogy of Thoreau died before Emerson, that in his eulogy of Thoreau could have been a captain of industry, but instead he decided to be the captain of the Huckleberry Patch. In other words, going around and berry picking with the kids. What Emerson doesn't say is that those kids were Emerson's kids, and that's part of that. Part of work in life is putting your back into small tasks that support yourself, that allow you to live a flourishing life without depending on others.
I mean, I almost thinks if Henry David Thoreau was around in the 20th century, he would have been a supporter of the movement for pay for housework.
I think so. I 100% think so.
He died at 44. So, I mean, young for today, but I don't know if that's young for his time.
Well, it was young for his time, even at that time. and he suffered through tuberculosis, which was the scourge of the 19th century. I mean, back then, people died of the 19th century, which simply meant they died of diseases that in the 20th century we would no longer have to concern ourselves with, at least in the modernized and affluent West. And so he dies at 44, and death was always this sort of presence in Thoreau's life. It was sort of the specter that haunted him. He goes to Walden after his own brother John dies of gangrene after nicking himself with a razor. Horrible, horrible, horrible luck. And Thoreau is interested in his words, improving the nick of time. In other words, improving the experiences of life because they are so short, ephemeral, and fleeting. And I think that's what he's up to at Walden when he's putting his back into his work.
John Kaag has been our guest. Again, John Kaag is the Donohue Professor of Ethics and the Arts at UMass Lowell and external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. He has joined us for a conversation about a book that he is the co-author of, along with Jonathan Van Belle. It's called Henry at Work, Thoreau on Making a Living. John Kaag, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.